Hi there, I'm Jen, this is Remembered Reads, and this is going to be a short discussion related to something that I saw in a number of versions of the Nonfiction on BookTube tag. The Nonfiction on BookTube tag was created by a book olive. I will link to her original video below. One of the questions in that tag asks for suggestions for people who don't read a lot of nonfiction to get into it. I think my answer was magazines and Wikipedia, but a lot of the other videos that I watched, in fact I would say maybe even a majority of them, suggested audio nonfiction. Which surprised me a little bit because I do think within all of the categories that fall into nonfiction, I do think that comedy writing and memoirs do tend to be superior when they are read by the author themselves. Because, for one thing, both of those styles of writing within those genres tend to be very conversational, and having the person themselves read it to you shows you where the emphasis is within things that they're saying about their own lives. And in the case of comedy writing, the timing is a big part of comedy. So having that, I think, does tend to be far superior, especially people who do accents, because that's always entertaining. Like, I think something like Trevor Noah's Born a Crime, where he's doing so many accents for characters, is obviously far superior in audio format than it is in written format. However, when a memoir is not written by the author, I think it's much more distracting. I'm currently listening to the audio version of Richard Wagamese's One Native Life, and the narrator who recorded this is not only not using a Northern Ontario accent, he's not using any kind of Canadian accent, he's using a very clear American, lightly Southern type accent. And it's incredibly distracting because this memoir is specifically about Richard Wagamese's experience growing up as someone from Northern Ontario, from an Ojibwe family. And to have this American accent is very odd. In the specific case of this book, the narrator also reads incredibly slowly. So by upping the speed of the narration, it disguises the accent a little bit, so I am still listening to it. In general, I think that anytime someone other than the individual, when it's a known person, narrates a book, ideally, I do think it takes something away when they have such a different accent. I tried to listen to Oliver Sacks's memoir a couple of years ago. I don't remember the title, it might have been On the Move, I don't know, I'll insert it here, which is also read by an American author. And the early parts of that are him describing his childhood in London during the Blitz. And it was just so distracting to have this, not just American, because I think there are certain East Coast American accents that are not that far from Oliver Sacks. Did lose a lot of his accent because he did live in the US, but that would be closer to what the accent he had at the end of his life. But this narrator had a very Midwestern accent and it was just bizarre. So I couldn't continue to listen to that. Now those elements are maybe a matter of taste. I think there are some people who are not distracted by differences between an author and narrator's accent in memoir. But even aside from that, I think if you look at such a huge variety of other subgenres within nonfiction, there are so many audio versions that don't contain the same content as the original. For example, Maya Angelou's Hallelujah, the Welcome Table, which is a collection of both essays and recipes. I read that a couple of years ago, and it's very interesting to have her write about incidents, situations, cultural points that feature food in some way, and then see the recipe afterwards, so you have a sense of what was involved in it, both time-wise and flavor-wise. And it's a really interesting combination. But the audio version of that only contains the essays. It doesn't contain the recipes, so you're missing out on fully half the content of that book if you listen to the audio. Similarly, I listened to the audio version of the book on the Columbine shootings by Dave, I'm forgetting his name, but I'll insert it here. And what I found, and even though that's a narrative style piece of nonfiction, I found it incredibly distracting to not know where direct quotes began and ended, so it was impossible to know what he was summarizing and what someone actually told him. Now, I think some people are maybe not as interested in specifics like that and are just in it for the story, so I can see why that might be more entertaining. More entertaining is probably the wrong word for a subject like that, but I can see why that wouldn't necessarily bother anyone. But in most forms of, I would say, history, a lot of kinds of journalism, a lot of anything talking about geography, biography, anything with a fat reference section, references are, in my experience, about 90% of the time not included in the audio version, which means that you're missing out on 10-15% of a lot of books, which is ignoring even things like charts, maps and charts, and photographs. And I'm always surprised that more people aren't distracted by the fact that they're missing out on this extra content. So because of that, I was shocked by how many people made the blanket comment about nonfiction on audio as opposed to a few specific subgenres where I do agree, because in memoirs and comedy read by the author, I absolutely agree. Especially because in some of those you do get more content. I know in Eddie Izzard's memoir, Believe Me, he had whole extra sections in there where he rambled on during the recording of the audiobook, so you were getting more content in that case. I think in Tiffany Haddish's memoir, The Last Black Unicorn, she sings a song at the end, which you wouldn't get if you were reading it. So again, in that subgenre, yes, that's the superior choice, you're getting more content. But across everything else, it does seem odd to me that if given the choice between both formats, people in general would choose the one that doesn't contain all of the content. Now, again, depending on your bookstores and library system, obviously you may have more access to one or the other. And depending on your ability to hear or see, one may be more accessible to you than the other. I thought it was curious that so many people have such a strong preference for nonfiction in general, not exclusively memoir or comedy, in audio. So I'd be curious to hear, if you have that preference, are you not disturbed by missing out on content? Or do you just not care, or do you just exclusively read narrative type nonfiction where it doesn't really matter that you're not getting the references? I'd be curious, because it's something that genuinely has surprised me to hear so often. Because while I agree, again, for memoir and comedy, I just genuinely would always rather have the larger quantity of content. And again, all of that assumes that you have equal access to both, because obviously some people are using apps or library subscriptions where one is more accessible than the other. And your auditory processing or hearing abilities in visual processing or vision may vary and make one more generally accessible than the other. But accepting those cases, I'd be curious to hear more. Are you more or less comfortable with one format versus the other when you're dealing with nonfiction in general and with subgenres? And are you happy giving up one more content to go with one versus the other? I'd be curious to know. Anyway, that's it for now. Ciao.